Good evening. I'm Catherine Hill. I am President and CEO of Levine Museum of the New South. And thank you for joining us tonight for what I think is going to be a very special program. A year ago, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, Levine Museum began a series of conversations that challenged us to explore the history behind racial violence and policing in this country. We called the series, What's It Going to Take? Because that's the question that we kept asking ourselves. What is it going to take to affect real change? Some of the people that you will hear from tonight were part of these conversations over the course of the year. I am delighted that Kema Pierce is moderating tonight's conversation. You will recognize Kema. She was Chief Operating Officer at Levine Museum until January when she and her family relocated to Atlanta. She is now Vice President of Strategy, Marketing, and Communications at the Woodruff Arts Center. And we are delighted to have her back.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you for being here, Kema.
Oh, you guys are home for me, and you know that. So
Yes.
I'm happy to be here for this really important, and you're right. It's going to be a very interesting discussion tonight.
It is indeed. Thank you.
So as Catherine noted, we as a staff a year ago, really out of frustration in what was happening in this country, put together this series, What Is It Going to Take? And I would like to say that, we've come a really long way since that time when George Floyd and countless others died at the hands of police officers. But we know that is not truth. And in fact, before I introduce our three panelists, I want to talk about our fourth panelist, Kristie Puckett-Williams, who was supposed to be with us. She's with the ACLU, and as we speak, she's in Elizabeth City. She has been part of the Andrew Brown protests, and as a result, she's unable to be with us because she's helping countless people who are, as we speak in real time, being arrested. And so it is still very relevant, that question, what is it going to take? I'm going to introduce our panelists, but know that all of them have done different programs around this topic for us over the past year, and each bring a very different perspective. But all of them, despite their job they get paid for, are very committed and involved in the community and very important issues. But I'm just going to give an overview of their paid job title, but know that they have such a huge impact in our community. First is Kieth Cockrell, who is the Charlotte Market President of Bank of America. Kieth was actually on the very first program that we did around this topic. And he is also board chair at the Levine Museum. So thanks, Kieth, for coming back with us.
It's a pleasure to be back with you, Kema. Welcome back.
Thank you. And next is Tiffany Fant, who also gave us such a great insight in one of our programs. I believe it was around Minnesota. We've done a few, Tiffany, so you have to correct me. But Tiffany is a social justice activist. She is a partner with Charlotte for Black Future. She's also a co-executive director of the nonprofit Soul Nation. One of the things that I love about Tiffany was her quote that was in the Charlotte Observer a year ago when she said, I protest to get your attention. Tiffany, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
And last but not least is Dr. Tekla Johnson. And Dr. Johnson's historian and archivist at Johnson C. Smith, and she is the author of several books, Black Power and the Politics of Race. And I probably messed that up, Tekla, but you're going to correct me when you come on. But let me just say this about Tekla. She has been a real friend to the Levine Museum. She has partnered with us. I mean, we are a history museum. We love to tap into her brain and her knowledge. And she's been a great partner with our historian, Dr. Griffin, in the community and educating this community on history. So Tekla, I messed up the title of your book, didn't I?
No, it's okay. It's actually Pleasure to be here. And I would just like to add that I also work at the University of South Carolina at Union, and so I better plug them in there as well. So
please. Yeah. Well, they're lucky to have you, and we're lucky to have you tonight. I'm going to start the conversation just asking all three of you, since you have been part of this program in the past, and you are living in America as we speak. And I really just want to know, taking a temperature a year later after the death of George Floyd, and we're at a point now where we actually have a conviction, right? But at the same time, when we got that conviction in Minnesota, in the middle of that trial, we had Daunte Wright, right, also killed. So we know that, sometimes it feels like one step forward and two steps back. And we know we have a lot of work to do in this country, but it's not just about police brutality. I mean, this is just an indication of some of the really important issues that America has to grapple with. And so I want to ask each of you, how are we doing? And we'll start with you, Tekla, if you want to give us a little historical background too, in your opinion.
Well, it would be great to come on here and be really optimistic, but the truth of the matter is we have, high infant mortality rate in our community. We have other signifying aspects of our experience in recent times that are parallel to the African people that lived in South Africa during apartheid. We thought we were done with that era with the 60s. A lot of people felt like we made progress. Some of us knew that our leaders were actually being, housed in prisons. Some of our most intellectual minds are being housed in prisons. I'm talking about members of the Black Panther Party and others. And so those voices got sort of stamped out in exchange for this idea that we are progressing. And so today, I would have to say that a year later after George Floyd, as far as data goes from the Washington Times and others, it looks like, we're on the same track for the same number of police killings again this year across the nation as a whole. If you want to look at, where we are just in terms of, American citizens versus those who would govern us or supposed to protect us, but instead, in many cases, there's a loss of life. And so we're on track for the same number of killings, which is about 1,000 a year. 181 of those have been so far since George Floyd been African Americans, which is about 18%, though we're 12 to 13% of the country. 37 of those have been whites, although they are still in the, according to the census anyway, 76 or so percent of the country. So although that case was, hopefully a victory and an expected outcome, as a result of international and national protests, still, I can't tell you what has changed.
Right. Anyone else? Well, let's start with you, Tiffany. What are your thoughts on that or anything else? It's pretty open.
I would just add that if not, I don't think we're any closer to solutions. The two biggest things I've seen is that more attention has been brought in getting into people's living rooms that normally wouldn't. Normally, it's usually the activists and advocates that know what's going on. But now the average person who may not be on the streets or involved in social justice work also knows. So I will say that attention and broad exposure is happening. And then the second thing is that money is becoming increasingly available to be thrown at the situation versus thrown at solutions, if that makes sense. So money's like, I think people, that's what I've noticed over the years, that a lot of money's become available. And I think with good intentions, but not necessarily directed at impactful solutions.
Yeah.
So those are the biggest changes.
Those are the big changes. Well, you know what? You set me up perfectly to go to Mr. Bank of America over here, because Kieth with the money and, I know the bank has really kind of put money towards a lot of change, especially locally in Charlotte. So talk to us about this and how it's in corporate America from your stance, they're responding and is it effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I begin by saying that, as I reflect on the year, we had an incredible sense of urgency because you just couldn't explain away these deaths anymore. We literally watched a healthy man die before our eyes. And I'm struck by, yes, I'm proud of many of the things, as Tiffany mentioned, that there's been increased capital, and it's definitely required. But we can't lose sight of the fact that there's still, as we speak here today, I think it's up to 43 states that are trying to restrict voting rights. Who would have ever thought in 2021 we'd be still fighting for the right to vote? And now, because of the efforts of Stacey Abrams and others, we recognize, hopefully, and will always remember how critical that power is to vote. Because so many of the things that we're still continuing with today, we're still debating what happened on January 6th. We're still debating history, our history. And so I'm encouraged in one sense because there's so many stories that were withheld. Within the next week and a half, we'll be reflecting on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. And for years, that story, for decades, not years, for decades, that story was withheld and lied upon. And then even today, we had to wake up to additional news of a Black man being killed and law enforcement lying about his death, suggesting that he was killed in a car accident, trying to avoid police. So I tend to be an optimistic person, but I choose action, because we got to get beyond, that call to educate and listen and have more dialogue a year ago to understand each other a little bit more. And so I am proud of what Bank of America has done, because we came out very quickly and committed $1 billion over 4 years. And we've since increased that to $1.25 billion for an additional 5 years. And recognition that it hasn't been fair. And so 17 Black colleges and universities and historic colleges focused on Hispanics, we gave each one of $1 million. The Atlanta Center came in your new hometown. The commitment to try to ensure that we can educate Black and brown youth and help them overcome the barriers so they can maintain their education, because we recognize that so many still need to work and support other family members while they're trying to complete their degree. But in addition, we've joined initiatives like 110, which is focused on the audacious goal of hiring 1 million Black men in corporate America. And I'm proud that we're one of the founding organizations to participate in that, because that's not just focused on getting people jobs, entry-level jobs. It's focused on recognizing that, hey, something needs to change. And do we really require an undergraduate degree for all of our entry-level positions and careers? Or do many of us in corporate America have very aggressive formal educational programs teach people the jobs that we need them to do? And so do we really require a 4-year degree for all these jobs? And that's what initiatives like 110 in corporate America is trying to combat, is to recognize that the things that we've done in the past, they were laced with barriers for entry and success for people that look like you and I. So it's a start, but there's still so much more that we must do.
Right. And I think I heard you say that, Tiffany. I want to come back to you because you are grassroots, right? You are on the ground locally, but also nationally. And we saw the marches last year. It was beautiful because it was a rainbow of people, right? It was very different in the 1960s when it was predominantly African American. The Jewish community came out. I mean, it hit everyone. But what are you seeing a year later? Was it a fad? Are you still seeing that kind of interest on the ground level? Is there still that urgency that we felt a year ago?
Absolutely, on the ground level. still the urgency and still the diversity of recognizing. A lot of it is, especially from who we call white allies, like want to see better, do better, and not necessarily know what to do better, right? Or differently. So like the interest is still there. And the urgency is always there because it never stopped. I mean, like, for example, Kristie never stopped because the murders and killings were still happening. So the work never stopped. It stopped for people when it stopped being aired on television, or stopped when it started making the rounds around social media. But if, having your finger on the pulse, it never stops, and you're constantly engaged with it in some form or fashion. And so, yeah, so like the urgency is still there. And in the role I play, I have so many titles, I'm not going to do them all, but I will say, like a lot of the work has also been understanding, bridging what's necessary between grassroots to the systems that are in place and corporate, and trying to lessen that gap, because unfortunately, a lot of times it's a wedge is trying to be drawn to say, oh, those rioters over there. No, those are the people that got your attention. To say it's a problem. And then there's a group that has to learn, that mitigates on what does it look like for solutions. And then there's those that hold the purse strings to say, hey, are you willing to give up some of these dollars to get to these solutions and look at your systems? So like a lot of the work has been lessening and understanding everybody's role, well, teaching people their roles and showing how it can work and should work instead of trying to wedge and pit people against each other, because this is a collective effort. And so that's my pitch, to say that I also work with my brother's keeper, Mr. Cockrell.
Right.
Yeah. So like my finger is on the pulse with a lot of things.
Right.
And like I do climate justice work with the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, which is a national platform, because as we talk about this police brutality, we also have a climate problem, right? So like when you start talking about all the issues that impact Black and brown people, that's just a whole other layer. And so working on that level to say, hey, we can't breathe in multiple ways. And so let's deal with all the ways in which we can't breathe to open up our airways.
Right. And like I said in the beginning of the show, you all are involved in I wasn't going to go through the litany of groups, but there's a lot of cross section here. So Tekla, I'm going to do to you what I hate people do to me when as a lawyer. But, I worked with Dr. Griffin for several years, and he taught me one thing, which is history informs our present and our future. And so I'm going to ask you, looking at history, because we now hear that we have, more of a spotlight on these issues and inequities. We have more money coming to it. Is there an example in history where we also have the infrastructure, that we can use as a map or guide us as we go forward to really have some real change? I think you're on mute.
I think, am I unmuted now? I think.
Nope, you're good.
Thank you, Alex. I'll say again, and I'll join Tiffany in throwing out some of my other associations, and one of them is the North Carolina Jericho, the National Jericho Committee, but also an initiative that they are a partner in. And I'm sorry, I am traveling, so you're gonna hear some background noise, but and that is a Spirit of Nelson Mandela initiative. And so again, I think a lot of our intellectuals are seeing parallels to our way out to freedom, which is going to take more than, corporate dollars that are going toward education. Traditionally, as a people, we have relied upon, and believed in education as a path to social mobility, which indeed it is. On the other hand, what are you going to do about the historical reality that, policing is rooted in or began in paralleled segregation, or before that, as Dr. Griffin and others have pointed out, came out of slave patrols? What are you going to do about the institution itself that is still wrought with its own history vis-a-vis Black people in this country? And the fact that it reflects not the majority of Americans, but enough in terms of the value and the insistence upon privilege for some, that we're going to have to deal with it. So whether that means what the ACLU is suggesting at this point and backing, which is an end to qualified immunity, whether it is outlawing police unions, which have gone the extra mile in making sure that that brotherhood of silence is kept up, which we saw break in the Chauvin case, fortunately for everybody, so that those who are doing a good job, the best they can do within the institution, are actually changing the institution from within. But I do think it's going to take some of those dollars from some of those corporate dollars. And I know I'm only half answering your question, but I think it's going to take taking those corporate dollars and that power and getting behind actually some of these specific change-oriented legislation in Congress, or which is what the ACLU is doing right now, and to say, hey, we can't have qualified immunity anyway. That goes back to your question, Kema, on history, because some people don't even believe we can reform these police institutions, that they have to be completely removed, defund the police, completely remove the institutions because they're inherently racist, because once the institution starts working, then an individual doesn't have to be racist to carry out the racist functions of the institution, sort of critical theory and some of these other things. So for me, it's saying, if we have the corporate dollars and we know the history of the institution, then the first thing to do would be to say, okay, community folks on the ground, intellectuals are all saying the same thing. ACLU, get rid of the qualified immunity. And so we need these dollars to be specifically geared toward these things that might work. Because if we don't try the things that might work, yes, there is going to be a bigger run-in, I believe, with fascism, with what Cheney is talking about right now, Congresswoman Cheney, that we're and you guys mentioned January 6th, that fascism means, a state that is, whose agents work, for itself and using the people toward that end, and it's going to be very dangerous. So I hope that we can all get behind this effort, this true effort for reform, so that we don't have to see what that conflict actually looks like, confronting fascism head on. Which some people may say we already are, but yeah.
That's right. And Keith, let me come back to you, because you are in circles with corporate leadership nationally, not just in Charlotte. And so you're hearing things that we may not hear. But one thing I do know about Bank of America and the organization that you lead is, you understand strategy and process and putting things in place. And so I know you're not just throwing $1 billion out there without also having the dialogue on how to really help it effectuate change. So, let us be a fly on the wall. What are the corporate leaders saying around this?
Well, there's much discussion. And what we've really tried to do is take a leadership role. Most recently, we announced that we'll move our minimum wage to $25 per hour. At Bank of America. That's for all jobs. 10 years ago, we were at $14 an hour. I believe, and I work for a company that believes that you can find the right balance between serving your shareholders, your clients, your community, and your employees. And for us, we believe that we can share the results of the hard work that we put in each and every day in these large corporations. I'm not trying to say that every small business owner can move to $25 an hour minimum pay, but for these large corporations that year after year have produced strong revenues and earnings, we're trying to lead by example, not just talk about it, but say that, can we provide a living, working wage? If you work for us, we are Bank of America. We believe that you should be able to have health care, good health care, and that you should be able to take care of a family and pay your bills and live the American dream of living in a home. We know that these types of things grow a community, protect against crime. And so it's getting at the root of some of these things that we're trying to exhibit some real leadership here. and get beyond just throwing money at the situation, but getting at the root cause of this. And if I can, Kama, just on this area of law enforcement. Years ago, under the Obama administration, policing in the 21st century report, it was a cross section of law enforcement, community leaders, and scholars who made these recommendations. Not just recommendations, but actually delivered a plan for implementation. But yet here we are still today, seeing that some of these basic recommendations that were actually introduced and submitted for implementation, with all of the police offices across this country, a small fraction of them have actually introduced this. So we still need to allow police chiefs the ability to fire law officers who are not worthy of protecting their citizens. We still need to ban choke and strangleholds.
Yeah.
We still need to ensure that there's transparency. Here we are, still, we have body cam, and we can't get access to body cam. Transparency is the way forward. So there's so much more that we must do in terms of this public-private partnership. I don't think that government has all the answers, nor do I believe that corporate America will have all the answers, but we can work in partnership with community leaders and listening to these community leaders and voters to provide a better society for all of us.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, the reason why we're down a panelist is because of a decision made by a leader in the police force, right? And we have the Andrew Brown protest. And so it goes back to, and so I'm going to throw this out to you guys, what politics play a big piece in this, right? And there still seems to be we have a more sympathetic president in office, but our Congress is still 100% deadlocked. I just read an article on the past, what Biden's been able to accomplish, and it's by executive order, but when it gets to Congress, and this is where he's actually put this police stuff, right? He's going to try to make legislation. It's deadlocked. And so, how do we, in your guys' opinions, talk about that? I mean, and I know the Voting Act, right? That's going to play into this, but it's very frustrating watching this deadlock continue.
If I could bring the spirit of Kristie into the room, because that's the
Please.
Like one of the, I know Kristie would definitely say abolish police, because when you start talking, the question I ask is, what parts of slavery do we want to keep? Because we all can agree that slavery was bad and should have been abolished, but what systems for slavery do we want to keep? And when we can answer that question, then we'll know the things that we need to begin to abolish. If we know that slave patrol started in slavery, we knew slavery was wrong, we abolished slavery to some extent outside of Amendment 13, that caveat. But if slave patrols were wrong, if slavery was wrong, slave patrols was wrong, so why is it that now somehow along the line police have become correct, right? So we have to begin to ask the hard questions to quit being so nice, right? We have to quit being nice. And Kristie's type of advocacy now is renegade advocacy, that she calls it. Instead of trying to be politically correct with some of these legislators and politicians, getting in their face and saying, yo, like, enough is enough. If you thought protesting in the street was something, we can go another level to show you what we're looking for you to do. And voting, we already are on the voting and understand voting is a part of it, but making it real and tangible for people to understand that now we are being more strategic about who we vote for, how we vote, and getting our people in line to vote, right? So that plus the renegade advocacy, because we're at a point now where it's like my grandma used to say, sick and tired of being sick and tired. And when you get sick and tired, you ramp up. It's like for those who have the privilege of sitting back and not being affected, they can take the time to be strategic, and I protest to get your attention. So like when we sick and tired, we're gonna go ahead and make that thing known, and to address like just the killings of in general, that is Black people, right? Like it's Black men and women. Unfortunately, the narrative really highlights Black males. But Black women are dying as well, right? So let's in the narrative, that's that divisive narrative, which continues to only get at part of the solution. Like, so we have a problem with how Black people are policed and how Black people are seen in police brutality and across all the systems, whether it's mental health, the carceral system, policing system. So like, it's just across the board. And so the narrative has to be that we have to change the material condition of Black people, because if we do that in this country, everyone will succeed. Regardless if you like us or not, if we change the material condition of Black people in this country, everyone would benefit. And that's the motto and understanding that people need to have.
Okay, so yes. So what's the barrier to that? I mean, honestly, in each of your opinion, like what are the barriers that are keeping us from what seems like a basic human right and equity if we're all so woke and conscious? What's stopping us?
People think they're gonna lose something. When was the last time anybody thinking that I gotta give you something that's gonna come out of my pocket, right? So what if I have to give you coming out of my $20? I'm really trying to hold on to my $20. So, and what you mean I gotta give you 10 of it to make this work? And that's the mentality. And that's that capitalist mentality that we have here, that, the collective can survive. The collective can do it, but we're so into individualism that that's the barrier. That's the ultimate barrier.
Yeah. And we have
if I can,
please, I was going to ask.
I would support Tiffany in this perspective that, a significant barrier is power. And so there's power in the people. And so now that we know, and we've been marching and all the things that we have continued to witness in the streets, we just can't let it go. And we have to continue to, there's that old saying that, when Black people are in pain, white people join book clubs. Well, how many of us have experienced, allies coming to us and saying, I'm with you, I stand with you, help, but I don't know what to do. Well, it's time for us to make it easy for them to engage, to make it easy, because there are those that are still not woke and not even trying to be woke, that are fighting to defend their power and their privilege. And we have to acknowledge that and never accept it.
Dr. Johnson, you want to add to this before I move to we have an audience question that I want to throw out. And you're on mute again.
Alex is muting me. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. I think you got me again unmuted. Thank you. There's a scholar named Dr. Hannah Sala, who has done a study of modern day prisons, and she's looking at modern day prisons because she's finding that 70% of them are brown and Black people in these prisons. And so what she did is she did a comparison study to slave forts and to plantations, and what she finds is the same torture devices, the same structures, and oftentimes the same grounds. The same plantations are now where the prisons are held. So in other words, that the system, in the same sense that Michelle Alexander says in her book, The New Jim Crow, that that segregation didn't really, or racism didn't really die out, it just changed forms. In the same sense, the economic exploitation and imprisonment of Black people to keep that system going hasn't changed either. So that though the prisons are called prisons now, but they still function the same way. The violence is the same way. The isolation is the same way. And so that things really haven't changed. In my own life, and I just want to sort of celebrate my co-speakers here today. Transparency is the way forward, which is a quote that Kieth said, which I love, and I do think that is true. And also Tiffany said, what parts of slavery do we want to keep? So I guess that brings me to my own theory that I've been working on for a couple of years, and its most recent form is called unrandom acts, where I view these police killings that appear random as actually unrandom and tied to the Tulsa and other race riots that happen, and that also are tied to vigilante police violence. That violence is actually, and we'll quote Frederick Douglass, who said slavery is a war from start to finish, that this violence is allowed by the state in degrees, it's allowed. And when it gets to completely excess and obvious, as in the case of Derek Chauvin with George Floyd, someone is a fall guy or reprimanded. But in general, that it's let out a bit at a time, and that it's part of this wider system of control. What is the goal? Is it for fun? No. It's for, as Tiffany says, there's an economic, underpinning to capitalism, it's economic underpinning to slavery, and this is where the questions get really tough. In what way? We got for-profit prisons. We got the fact that the 1% have the majority of the wealth in this country, and that there has to be some way of appeasing those folks who feel they need privilege. There was a great book written called The Wages of Whiteness about the beginning of this system of dividing, Black workers from white workers and giving the wages of privilege to the white workers to support the elite. And so we still see that going on. So if we're going to get down to the tough questions, it's going to be, those January 6th, what is going to happen with that? This element that is the government going to allow them, as we saw that of course under Trump presidency it was going to be allowed, but are we going to allow this fascism to continue within the country that's based upon race, but really it's allowed to happen, this violence against brown and Black people, in order that wealthy elite can continue? That's what I would say. Are we going to do that? Because that's what we've been doing for the last several hundred years.
I like that theory on random acts.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, I think you all know that we have audience members can send in some questions, and we have one that's it's still on topic, but it's shifting, and I think it's an important shift. So I'm going to read it to you. In the past year, the killings of Miss Taylor and Miss Bryan and others have shown the impact of racism and policing on Black women and girls. Have you noticed shifts related to gender in the national conversation, which has most often been about Black men and boys? Anyone?
Go ahead, Keith.
Well, I was just going to begin by saying that, we just had this overwhelming perception of maleness. When I look at the WNBA and the women of the WNBA and really the action, Black and white women of the WNBA, and how much praise or recognition or exposure did they really receive compared to their counterparts in the NBA? I'm not trying to take anything away from my brothers in the NBA, but the whole movement and the role that women have played, Black women have played, not only most recently in Black Lives Matter, but throughout our history, quite frankly. And so it's not lost on many of us that for whatever reason, and it's historical, Black women still are not praised enough for who they are and what they have been, the strength that they have continued to provide to this world. But in addition, with the progress that we're making, we're still not seeing enough queens matriculate in corporate America as quickly as we're seeing and responding to, Black men, and in some cases, Latino, Hispanic, and ascending and getting opportunities. So it's a constant fight, and we have to call these situations out and continue to express disappointment. I like to use the phrase that I am pleased that we've made progress, but I'm no way satisfied.
Thanks, Keith. Let me hear from my sisters in the fight, in the community. What's your thought on this?
Is there a noticeable shift? No. I know there's a noticeable shift in trying to amplify. Like definitely trying to, especially like with Say Her Name, that started with Sandra Bland, because somehow, and this is something that we have to deal with the concept of patriarchy, especially as it exists within the Black community and outside of the Black community, that somehow Black woman's life is somehow less valuable, or her death is less valuable to be amplified. When we have to be the ones to lift that whether it's a Black man, Black woman, Black child, that or a person, that when a person is killed, their death there's no lifting up one or the other. Like it's unfathomable to me that we have to have the discussion around who's more important, because I think that creates that oppression Olympics about, well, more Black men are getting killed than Black women. Well, they're all getting killed. So let's start there. So has the narrative shifted? No, but I think there is more of a push to really say women's names when they are getting killed. And like part of my work is that when we have discussions, to make sure I'm bringing others into the conversation as necessary to keep the balance, whether it's from some of my other work where we're lifting and naming marginalized communities within Black community. I said, but we can't leave out the Black male. He may need to be taught and how to show up differently, but we can't name all these other groups of Black folk and then leave him out. And then on the flip side, I understand like what we're doing with My Brother's Keepers. I was like, yo, we are doing an excellent job. Let's talk to these Black mothers as well that are raising these Black and brown young men and making sure that they're on cue and on staff for what we're doing as well. Just, not highlighting, not elevating, but saying, bringing them into the conversation, because everyone has to be a part of the conversation if we're really going to get the solution instead of pie slicing this thing out. So yeah, has it shifted? Not like it should. Not like it should. We should be, if we're going to hit the streets, we should be hitting the streets for every last one that is killed at the hands of police officers with the same fervor and equity that we do for everything else, for any of our brethren that are slain.
Right. Thank you. Tekla, anything to add?
I would just agree with everything that my colleagues have said, but just wanted to throw out missing African-American women and girls by the hundreds, if not thousands, trafficking, missing body parts, what's up with that, rise of incarceration of women. There's a whole organization around women being forced to give birth while shackled in prison, the rise of infant mortality rates, and then versus, of course, Black women as organizers, Black women as members of social movements, leading voting rights, and women's rights are human rights.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. And thank you for the question from our audience. One of the things that after we do these programs and have this discussion, we sometimes would get emails, and I'm no longer with the museum, but I'm sure this is still happening. People want to know what they can do, right? They're fired up by listening to this conversation. They're frustrated. And so I want to just ask each of you to shout out or highlight, whether locally or nationally, who are some of the leaders that we should be looking at? What are some of the organizations? I heard My Brother's Keeper that, we could be looking at that, if someone wants to give their time or give their purse, we can direct them to in the Charlotte local area or nationally, because I know we're going to get that question like, okay, this was a great conversation, but, what can I do with it? So I'm just going to do a round robin and you all share.
Well, if I could start, Tiffany has mentioned My Brother's Keeper. This time last year, that was one of the areas that I made a decision that I want to be actively engaged in. Can't we all support youth? I mean, many of us are parents. Is there anyone that couldn't rally behind trying to ensure that a young person, Black, white, brown, purple, green, couldn't dream and have an opportunity to fulfill their dream? And so I just felt in my personal situation that I had really done so much inside of the firm that I lead that I got in the way as I was pursuing my career. I used to be very, very active with the Police Athletic League, and that was my ministry on the west side of Charlotte. But as I continued to advance in my career and relocate and things of that nature, I got away from some of that. And so, thank God, I recognized that I wasn't visible. I wasn't proximate, if you will. So these young boys could see me and aspire to be me, because I'm not on TV shooting a basketball or catching a football for a touchdown. But so boys and girls clubs, regardless of who you are, can't you just say that I'm going to spend some time just to get to know a young person and show them something different? When I was a youth, I was fortunate because I had teachers and coaches who saw something in me. It exposed me to things that my grandparents could never expose me to. They weren't formally educated. They were working all the time. So for me to get back and forth to practice, it required a coach to pick me up, to get me to and from practice. And guess what? That drive time, they poured something into me to expose me to things that even my grandparents couldn't expose me to. So truth be told, that when I was a youth, it was white men and women who in many cases, when I made the decision to study engineering, I didn't know an engineer, white or black. But it was a white person who said, hey, you seem to be good in math and science. Consider engineering. So it's because of what people saw in me, that I feel this strong desire and calling to at least try to help another youth come through and expose them to something different. And for me, my brother's keeper was the perfect outlet to reach out. And I'm just thankful that we have folks like Tiffany who's continued to expand our view of just not reaching that young man, but getting to the parent and getting inside that household and making sure they get internet access and they got the ability. Everybody's talking about, people don't want to work, or, how are you going to.
Thanks, Keith. I think you froze in the end, at least for me, but thank you. That's so true. And Tiffany, Tekla, do you have a shout out maybe locally for people who are just now still looking to get plugged in and help?
Well, sure. Sure. Thank you. Definitely my brother's keeper, especially if you're a Black male looking to be in community. Definitely sign into there. But then nationally, like Movement for Black Lives is a national organization that really has a plan that's overarching, that if people want to plug in on that level. Then locally, Charlotte for Black Futures, we're continuing to refine on how we can show up. So like we have the protesting part down. We have that part down in demands, but like how do we continue to move and transition into building the strategies out that we need in order to create systems and create a system of change. So Charlotte for Black Futures is another place. And then Soul Nation is definitely soulnation.org. Where it's climate justice, where we deal with the environmental and social. So we take on the hefty task of making that connection between all the things that we know about and how that literally correlates to the physical environment that we're in, and how environmental racism and systematically Black and brown people are still held down that way. So those are the ones that I would name that can give you different levels and different ways of being involved, from being super involved to I can give a couple dollars, but I would say educate yourself either way, whether it's finding out what all of them do, just so you can be abreast on the issues and know what's really going on and how they're connected. I think would be helpful.
Thanks, Tiffany. Tekla?
I have three I'd like to throw out. One of them is just a nuance on something Tiffany said. Yes, there is a national Black Lives Matter movement. There are some folks who, feel like they would rather identify with the Black Lives Matter as an organic, community-based instead of a national headquarters. It's out of their community. So there's also a organic Black Lives Matter movement as distinguished from necessarily the organization in your community. And so you can reach out there if that's your preference as well. I also want to mention something I said earlier, but I wanted to highlight it. There is an International People's Tribunal looking at several of these patterns against Native Americans and African Americans that it has several terms applied to it, including ethnic cleansing, genocide, in terms of what is, sort of the long view. And there's a meeting in New York City on October 23rd. Please look for that. You can go on the JerichoMovement.org website and look for, or you can go on the Spirit of Nelson Mandela Initiative website, and you can look for those. You can also contact me. I also want to point out that if you want to know more about this, the police violence and cases of policing, the National Association of Black Lawyers held hearings back in January and February of this year, 2021, international hearings where international jurists listened to the families talk about what happened to their loved ones. And I think they were like, and I think it was at least 50, if not more, cases where Black people were killed at the hands of police, and what happened to the families as a result. And so that's another place you can go for more information. Of course, you want to be interested in the Jericho, North Carolina. You can also contact me as well.
Thank you. Those are great suggestions. And we have one more audience question that I think it's a good way to go out. But before we do, since I no longer work for the Levine, I don't think it's self-serving when I say that Levine Museum of the New South is also a resource for this community. They do a lot of great educational programs, and they're really empowering our young people to, not only see themselves in our history, but see that that knowledge it will help them really empowered to have a voice in our local government or when they grow up. And so I encourage people to come out to the museum as well in their programming and embrace their history. And so the final question is, you have it right up, thank you. So thinking about what Kieth said, Kieth, you inspired this question, said about the need to educate more white people who are clinging to privilege. Have you observed alongside an increase in white awareness of these issues, an increase in white allies taking responsibility for educating other white people in this past year?
I'll begin. I think there was a surge last year. And as I mentioned, people were looking for books to read and join book clubs or added, white privilege books to their docket to review. But I'll be very candid with you. We just cannot stop there. As we all are looking forward to, some semblance of normalcy and gathering, when it's safe, I'm going to encourage you. I'll ask you this question. Who do you really invite into your home or into your backyard? Do they look like you exclusively? Or do you invite people and introduce those people to your children who look differently than you, who worship differently than you? I do believe in what Brian Stevenson has said, is that it's important for us to become proximate. And I'd like to believe that if we can get more people to recognize that we really do live a different experience through our life, it doesn't make you better or me worse, it's just different. And then if I can introduce you into that difference and realize that I have the same hopes and dreams that you have, that, my children are going to have an opportunity to dream and become everything they wish to be. And so I look forward to having an opportunity. I've missed people, and I'm looking forward to inviting more people into my home or my backyard. So I found my voice in a different way. It's never been silent, but I've got an obligation, I believe, now than ever before, to share perspective and help people understand my lived experience and see it.
Thank you.
And before I answer the question, I want to make a distinction. Black Lives Matter, which started in July 2013, is different than Movement for Black Lives, which started in December 2014. Movement for Black Lives is a coordinated strategy. So just want to make that distinction.
Yeah. Thanks, Tiffany.
Why they named them the same, I do not know. That closely related, but whatever. But yeah, there's that distinction. But to answer the question, luckily, I am grateful and fortunate enough that the white people in my circle are cool with the radical of my Blackness. And so I can go all the way off and they're not offended. As a matter of fact, they try to take those opportunities to learn and go back and educate their people without it having been an intentional, let me educate you, then you go teach, versus, oh, Tiffany didn't know this was happening. Let me go get my people together. So that's been a theme over the last year, definitely, of go get your people together. Let us do this over here, but you go get your people. You go talk to them. Go talk to your church members. Go talk to your neighbors. You go over there and talk to them. So I think there has been a rise in that, in ownership in that. That by being proximate to Black folk and just, listening and being in relationship, they're taking that information and going and sharing it with their people in different ways. And like for me, I said, that is not my ministry. So I will not get in the middle of that. So I will try to give you as honest and transparent information as possible. And then however you need to deliver that to your people, then you deliver that. And hopefully, and you're doing that work, that we can all become proximate, because I'm too focused over here to have that be my ministry. So yeah, I would say there has been an increase because now I get inboxes. Okay, Tiffany, so about this group here, we want to support, but we want to make sure that it's impactful and in alignment. And different organizations are saying, okay, we want to lean more towards being anti-racist and being in alignment with Movement for Black Lives. And what does that look like? And what do we need to deal with? And it's conversation among primarily white folks. So I excuse myself from those conversations as well. Like, this has nothing to do with me. So yeah, I would say it has been an increase. And they're still figuring it out though. But it's good for that progress nonetheless.
Thank you, Tiffany. Tekla, it looks like you have the last word this evening, my dear. And you're on mute.
And I did it to myself this time, not Alex. Thank you. I would agree with Tiffany to, especially in a historical sense. Malcolm X he told white people who asked to help, go to your community and teach, right? And so I would agree. I would also say that I teach my students of all races that we come from Africans, that we are, all related to an African, early African ancestor as far as the forensics and anthropologists are concerned. And I believe this is true in terms of our DNA. So we're all one people. So we really are talking about a human problem. There's also a great book called Problems in European Culture, written by a white person who looks at cultural problems in terms of xenophobia that has come out of, in some contexts, come out of Eurasia or Europe. And so we're really not talking about, a problem that can't be changed. Culture is hard to change, but it's not impossible. And so I think I guess examples I give my students are, Christians persecuting Jews, women who were accused of witchcraft being hung, Jews across Europe being persecuted, Israel versus Palestine, even to today. So this is a human problem, and it's going to have a human solution. And so to that end, I would say that the folks who made the difference in the George Floyd trial, according to the attorneys, were those folks who cared, who stopped on that street of all races and all ages and cared, all socioeconomic backgrounds, and cared enough to say enough.
Tekla, that is so true. If you watch the trial, it was very moving. They all came together and bared witness. So thank you for that. And thank you, Kieth, Tiffany, Tekla. I don't even want to hang up because there's just so many more topics I would love to get you guys to weigh in on. But I think you have done this 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death and the birth of this program great justice. And so on behalf of the Levine Museum, I want to thank you. And I will do what Alex expects me to do. So when I was working with him, I always like to end these with a quote. So I'm going to do a real quick one, which is one that we all know by Frederick Douglass. If there's no struggle, there's no progress. So we're all in the struggle, and I hope and I know the three of you are deep in the struggle, and please continue on. Everyone, have a good evening.
Thank you.